For my presentation, I chose the article Yuck, You Disgust Me, Effective Bias Against Interracial Couples. So this study was based on other research that talked about negative opinions or stereotypes people basically had about interracial relationships. And the past studies shown that only 11% explicitly disapproved, which means they just publicly came out and said they disapprove of these interracial relationships. On the other hand, 16 to 37% disapprove when it comes to close relatives, so that increased by a good amount. And then 50% of white individuals on dating apps were not willing to date Black individuals. So that just gives a background of like what the other studies shown and what we're going to go into in this study. So they wanted to know if people really felt disgusted by white and Black interracial relationship and how they played a role. And so that's why they just chose the white-Black couples, because previous criticisms that people had on these couples. Many of the participants were also white in this study, as you can see in the next slide, but the two main things the first study wanted to find out was, do people engage in interracial relationships? And its acceptance of interracial relationships correlated with disgust levels of these couples. So I chose study one, and it was all undergraduate students from Midwestern universities, and there was a total sample size of 152. They had more completed, about 200, but the final sample size was 152. And the age was a range, but it was obviously college students, so the mean age was 19, and majority white. So for this one, participants were asked to fill out an online questionnaire with the same 3 questions. The first question was, rate how disgusted you feel about interracial relationships between Black and white individuals. So this first question was asked on a scale from 1 to 100, which 1 was like, they don't feel this way, they're not disgusted, but 100 was they were very disgusted. And to hide the hypothesis in this study, they used words like happy and angry throughout, so they didn't really focus on the word disgusted. The second question was, rate your acceptance of romantic relationships between Black and white individuals. So this one had 2 different parts because it asked about Black men with white women and Black women with white men. And it was also on a scale, but it was on a scale from -5 to they do not accept it at all to 5, which is very acceptable. And the third question was, they asked about your own willingness to engage in interracial relationships. So I really liked this question they had because it had so many parts. It asked participants 5 different questions. If they were willing to date a Black person, live with a Black person, marry a Black person, or have a child with a Black person. And you could choose between not a good idea, I would not do this, but it is okay for others, I would do this, or I have done this. And seeing the results for this one, it was just so interesting to see how each of them compared to each other. So this is the results for the first 2 questions we asked participants. Overall, we found that acceptance rate correlated pretty strongly with disgust levels. As you can see in the graph over here at -5, which means they do not accept at all, the disgust levels are about 60. And on the other hand, if you go down to +5, the disgust levels are down to 0, which means they weren't disgusted at all. And also from this question in the study, we learned that disgust levels were a little higher for white women with Black men compared to Black women with white men, which makes sense in today's society. So here's the results from the last question we asked. And they were asked many questions about how they would personally interact, but I mainly focused on just dating or the relationship. So more than half of the sample say they would date a Black person, which there goes back to the explicit saying they would do this. On the other hand, there was a decent amount of people that said it was not a good idea, which is the light blue, and then the dark blue was not a good idea for them, but it was okay for others if they did this. But we can also see that only 9.5% has ever even dated a Black person, which obviously there's some negative bias because this would be like saying you don't like a certain food or you don't like a certain car just because you haven't tried it out. So this study showed that there were high rates of public acceptance of interracial relationships. This means that basically, although people may act different or change their opinions behind doors, most people say they accept Black and white relationships, but we know that there's a difference between public and in private. Second thing we learned that disgust is strongly associated with bias against interracial roommates. This is important because when someone feels more disgusted by a couple, they may treat them differently or in a negative way. The last thing we learned is we could not know the causal relationship and not sure whether interracial romances actually elicit a disgust response. And this is because there are many different factors that could play a role in these questions. And they were also based on like personal opinions and personal experiences. So they could be more or less biased of what they would be in real life. Why should you care? So we need to learn how to be more inclusive in interracial relationships. As a society, we basically need to be able to accept others for who they are and who they love because it's 2020 and we need growth from away from racial stereotypes. Another reason is we need to learn how biases can affect a person's individual relationship. So negative biases about others can negatively affect someone's personal relationship because just like anything else, it can cause tension between the couple. And like, for example, if your parents do not accept your relationship of someone like of color or vice versa, it can not only affect the relationship you have with your family, but it can really negatively affect the relationship you have with your romantic partner. And the last one is negative stereotypes in today's society about Black individuals. And it really needs to change, as we can see with everything going around in today's society and the world. Our society needs to learn how people think and how we can transition to a more positive change in order for everyone to feel loved and for everyone to be accepted in the world. So that's why I think that this PowerPoint was so important with what is going on with today's society and how bad it is with racial stereotypes. I just feel like it's good to learn, and hopefully it'll teach people to grow away from these negative biases they have on interracial couples. Thank you.